Hello and good evening, all of you. In today's daily news analysis. In today's video, we'll discuss two topics. One is the Hindu First editorial, which talks about the resilience of supply chain in Indian economy, and the second article is related to the tragedy of the conservation. So let's understand both of these articles. I just need 10 minutes of yours. Okay, so let's start that. Now, coming to what has happened. Now, pandemic is a big lesson for all the people, all the economies who were practically dependent on supply chains from China. So this is GS paper 3 and Indian economy, issues related to planning, mobilization, resources, supply chain management. Now, resilient supply chain as a pandemic lesson. So let's understand the context of that. So when the pandemic struck, naturally we know that it started from China and that kind of disrupted the supply chain. All the countries, including India, Australia, Japan, all of them got impacted. But let's understand the realities of that impact and how a country like India should overcome that. A key lesson learned by the world during the COVID-19 pandemic has been importance of creating resilient supply chain. These can withstand disruption and ensure reliability for the global economy. Now, disruptions in supply chain can be natural or man-made. Now, remember, what happened this year was maybe a unique situation which usually happens once in a century, but still it does not deter or maybe make this fact less important that disruptions did happen to a higher degree. Now, what are the examples that kind of disrupted India in real sense? Now, we all know that the attack in Saudi Arabia happened in September 19, where the Aramco oil refinery got hit by a terrorist drone. Now, that suddenly dropped the supply chain of oil, impacted India. बहुत तेजी से 5.7 million barrel का production came down, okay, and there was a steep plunge in the Saudi Arabia stock market and spike in global oil prices. Now, remember, West Asia has been a very turbulent place, especially because of whether the jihadi violence or because of the Shia Sunni sectarian violence. So there are some problems which are already there. So this example where supply chain got impacted, it impacted India as well, because we could see that several Indian companies felt the disruption in automotive, electronics, and white goods sectors. Similarly, let's talk about the pharmaceutical sector. Now, we all know that India is basically a pharmaceutical, India is the pharmacy of the world. And under that reality, India has been providing supply to the whole world. But let's come to the real fact. हम pharmacy हैं, but remember, one of the important thing of making any medicine is API, that is active pharmaceutical ingredient. ये active pharmaceutical ingredient is basically imported from China. Okay, it is imported from China, and that is a big challenge because during pandemic, when China was under the crisis, we saw the supply of API impacted, which means the supply of medicine production in India also got impacted. If you remember, in the last month, I discussed about bulk drugs, where India is pushing for production of active pharmaceutical ingredients in the recent time. So this is one example how India got impacted. Now coming to, let's understand the dynamics in real sense. Now in the current context, the greater weaponization of trade and technology is here to stay. And if you try and understand that India, Japan and Australia, हमने मिलके सोचा that why don't we try to overcome this challenge of supply chain disruption, and that is where they started a very good initiative called Supply Chain Resilient Initiative, SCRI. Okay, and that focused on automobiles, petroleum, steel, textiles, financial services, and IT sector. So the idea is that if anything is imported from outside, and the dependency should be reduced, and there should be a backup for that. The SCRI may be bolstered by future involvement of France, though this might depend on European Union's position. Now, which means that we have to be ready for all these things in future. अगर कल को फिर से ऐसा कोई crisis आता है, maybe trade war happens, or maybe China forcefully focuses on disrupting the supply chain, then in that situation we do have a backup for that. China has also resorted to similar tactics, maintaining advantageous trade and economic engagement with India without relenting on strategic issues. Now, at one end, we can see what is happening in the northern border of India, in the Galwan Valley, or maybe the border areas of the Ladakh region. At the same time, the trade is also going on. Now, China is basically knows that India has a dependency on these things, so they will take advantage of that. However, the normalcy in relation is not there. So, India या किसी भी country को हमें where they'll have to create a mechanism where the dependency is less. Now, similarly, let's come back to Australia. Now, you must have heard that how Australia and Japan relationship in recent time has come down. China has often used economic leverage to weaken opponents' resolve in contentious issues. China को जब भी आप क्वेश्चन करो, criticize करो, then China uses the economic leverage. They can disrupt your supply chain. Now here, Australia ने भी question किया. What Australia did? Australia questioned China, and they said that there should be an inquiry in the coronavirus. And China was also questioned on Indo-Pacific vision. कि भी आपका Indo-Pacific vision क्या है? Now, if you see Indo-Pacific vision, there are few areas where China is trying to control. For example, South China Sea, East China Sea, the Indian Ocean. It is moving ahead in Indian Ocean with making strategic investment across many countries. Now, this means, now this is what was questioned by Australia. But China ने कैसे respond किया? China imposed sanctions on key exports. Australia के जो exports उनको impact किया, grain, beef, wine, coal, and all these things were, which were coming from Australia, they were stopped. So this is basically focusing that you can't criticize me. Now coming to Japan. Japan has also invested billions of dollars in Chinese economy, and many of the companies globally are linked with manufacturing facilities and supply chain of China. Now here, China ने क्या किया है? There was a strategy called China +1 business strategy aimed at diversification in Asian nation. China diversify कर रहा है अपने investments को, and 89 Japanese companies availed subsidies to diversify out of China. अब ये जो subsidies जो China ने दिए, the subsidies went out to companies of Japan and they made their base. Now, because of this pandemic and because of this challenge, 57 companies relocated to Japan and 30 to East Asia and 2 to India. यानी already जो companies हैं Japanese वो China को छोड़ के आ रहे हैं. So this is basically that is because they know that China is not a country where we can trust. But let's come back to India. India को क्या impact पड़ा? Let's understand the reality. China is a bully in the world, and the first thing we saw that there was a disruption in the global supply chain, and India was getting impacted. China went offline when pandemic struck there. India की अगर बात करते हैं, so India की, if I talk about automobile sector in particular, so 27% of import comes from China. Now there was sudden challenge where shortage of braking components, electrical components, interior, lighting fixtures, ये सारा होने लगा, and that impacted. So Indian manufacturing, now remember, if I talk about India's two-wheeler sector or even four-wheeler sector, India is one of the top countries in the world in terms of production. And the technology and R&D which has happened in India, it is world-class. Now coming to, still there's a dependency. So आप देखो ये question mark create करता है that what is the future for such sector if you are still depending on countries like China. Now let's come back to another country. Medical devices. Now India is the fourth largest market in the medical devices, but 80% dependency is on China. The biggest exporters to India in this field are China, US, Germany, Singapore, and Japan, and that is not sustainable. That means we have to create mechanism. India की electronics industry की बात करते हैं. Now, if you see India's electronics industry, it is flooded with Chinese item. The electronic industry last year, it was $120 billion, or it is expected that it might reach to $400 billion in the next few years by 2025. Now, government already knows this, and government is promoting domestic manufacturing of printed circuit board, components, and semiconductors. If you remember, recently, a few months ago, production linked scheme PLI, government launched kiya hai, and that is just to boost manufacturing in India. Then coming to defense. Now, defense is another area which is a key pillar of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat basically talks about that we have to strengthen India, and this challenge of global supply chain can be the effect can be reduced. So here, the defense, we are trying to give a big boost to defense manufacturing in India under Make in India program, and India has already identified import list of 101 items, negative import list. इसका मतलब ये है कि these import items should be reduced in the coming years, and we have to strategize and focus on developing our own production in India. So that is a tremendous opportunity. Now remember, a lot of people understand that Atmanirbhar Bharat is more about creating production or developing production in India. See, it is a focus. It focuses on production, ensuring that India's manufacturing system develops. However, it does not mean that we want to stop the imports. We are just trying to create an alternative of import. India is not an economy which should be dependent on the world, and hence we have to create our own system. And we don't want, we are not saying that foreign companies are not allowed. Even foreign companies can come and set up our base in India, and that is the focus. What is the way forward? Atmanirbhar Bharat is aimed at strengthening India's capacities to participate more vigorously without being prey to the global supply chain disruption. India has the capacity to and the potential to become one of the world's largest destinations for investment and one of the world's largest manufacturing hubs after a math of pandemic. So maybe this is a future. Maybe this is what government looks or should be focusing on. Now, if I say that what do we see, for India in 2030? Yeah, 2030 we can see that India can boost and become one of the countries where manufacturing is basically develops, or we reduce our dependency on import. Maybe that is the way forward. India has the potential, and the series of reform which have happened in the last 2-3 years is a testimony to that fact. So this is the Article 1. Let's come back to Article 2. So I hope you got the understanding of that. Now, Article 2 talks about the tragedy of conservation, GS3, and this is biodiversity, conservation, environmental pollution, and degradation. Now, what is the problem? Let's understand. Now, we all know that India has some very famous biodiversity hotspots, and in 2012, 39 areas of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and reserved forest were declared in the Western Ghats were declared as World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Now, what is the meaning of declaration of World Heritage Site? It means that a special effort will be made for conservation and sustainability. Now, these sites are crucial for biodiversity value, and 10 of them are in Karnataka. Since that time, Ministry of Environment and Forests began identifying potential heritage site, and there has been unrest among the indigenous people. Indigenous people मतलब जो वहाँ के लोग हैं. Now remember, one end you want to conserve the forest, but indigenous people who are basically tribals, they feel that you are intruding in their right. Now, जब ये problem होने लगा, and let's go little back to the history and understand what India did. Before reform period, especially in 1990, India passed a law called Forest Conservation Act 1980. That stopped the indigenous people, tribals, to control the land or get into the forest. Now that created a lot of unrest among the tribal people, and you can see how the naxalism. So naxalism is also one of the factors which kind of came, and hence government believed that now we have to ensure that forests get back their right. In that backdrop, हमने दो law बनाए. The first is the Forest Right Act 2006, which basically gives rise to the indigenous tribal people, and Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People in 2007 by United Nations. So ये जो दो law हैं, they basically protect the indigenous people and tribals. Now that is in conflict, but can we say is it really in conflict? Not really. उसका reason ये है that tribal people have a very high concern for environment, and they try to protect the environment as well. However, they also see the forest or the minor forest produce as their source of livelihood. So let's come back to this article now. Indigenous people of the Western Ghats, including particularly vulnerable tribal group, constitute 44% of tribal population and almost 7% of the Karnataka. So indigenous people जो Western Ghats के हैं, उसमें एक बहुत particular tribe है, that is particularly vulnerable tribal group, PVTG. Now these PVTG mainly reside in this place, and they are the people who are getting impacted. Coming back to the Karnataka's record, Karnataka has a dismal record in implementing the Forest Right Act, and जो भी उनके claims रहे हैं, very less claims, only 5.7 claims by the indigenous people have been settled. 70% of the claims were disposed. Now, what is the meaning of claim? Claim का मतलब ये है a tribal saying that this is a land I can use for my own agriculture inside the protected zone. Okay, so according to Karnataka, tribal applications constitute 17.5 of the claims, and nearly all of them are settled. Other claims were rejected as they were not backed by valid evidence. Now, what exactly the claim should be based on? मैं एक tribal हूँ, and I'm a forest dweller, so I have a right to use forest for my own livelihood. But I have to prove that I am a forest dweller, and that is what this law talks about. So, Forest Right Act is not about discrimination, indiscriminate distribution of forest land to anyone applying for it. As per the law, those lands are recognized where people prove their occupation not later than 2005 as a forest dweller. यानी अगर आपने 2005 तक forest dweller अपने आप को prove कर दिया है, then you have the right to use the forest land, not otherwise, which means others cannot use it. The government record also reveals 43 lakh hectares of forest land were encroached both legally and illegally until 1980 Forest Conservation Act came into force. इससे पहले when there was no real law, the encroachment happened in these areas, and that is where government believed that now we have to conserve it. तो अब एक तरह से there is a a situation where you have to protect the tribal rights. At the same time, you have to look at ensuring that only the rightful people should get that right. The Global Environment Outlook Report 5 mentioned there's a decreased biodiversity across the globe as protected areas have been expanding. So decreased biodiversity hona shuru ho gaya in spite of the fact that protected areas have been expanding. So what is the way forward? The way forward is that ये जो declaration है World Heritage Site by Western Ghat is very important in preserving the biodiversity as recognition of the rights of the people who depend on the forest. मतलब World Heritage Site ये भी recognize करता है that the forest dwellers should have the right. And we have enough instrument. We have Forest Right Act, we have Dwellers Act, and all these people can meet the objective of resettling these people at the same time conserving the forest. So government must make an effort to build trust between its agencies in the area and the people who depend on these forests by treating them as equal citizens like anyone else in the country. So there should not be a discrimination of these people on the account of or on the in the pretext of that these people are misusing the forest land. So that completes the article 2, and so that is all for today. We have 2 questions from mains in the mains marathon. The first one: explain the contribution of extremists and revolutionaries in India's freedom struggle. 100 words. Question number 2: the government of India has taken efforts in direction of expansion and modernization of major ports in the country. So this is a topic from GS3 infrastructure, and this from GS1 the freedom struggle. So that is all.